Olga from Minerva. Today we're going to be sewing up the Butterick 5935 pattern. This is an average difficulty pattern for a close-fitting, lined and boned corset with a bias binding finish, which is what I'm wearing right now. Features an extension at the back, a shaped hemline, and options of either front or back lacing. View D also features some ruffles along the upper edges and around the arms. Views A and B have the ribbons at the front, and View C features a trim around the waist. Today we're going to be making View A. This pattern is designed for light to medium weight fabrics like wool, velveteen, brocade, satin, taffeta, chintz, cotton, or other cotton blends. So let me show you what fabrics and materials we're going to be needing for this project.
For the main fabric, we're going to be using this gorgeous Minerva Core Range cotton velvet fabric in the color bottle green. We'll need about 70 centimeters of this. It has the most beautiful sheen of velvet. It's super soft, and because it's cotton, it will be very comfortable as well. We'll need a contrast fabric to make the bias binding, and we're going to be using our Minerva Core Range 100% cotton poplin fabric in our color bottle green as well. This cotton poplin is a great quality and super soft as well, plus it has the typical crispness you'd expect from a poplin. We'll be needing 1.3 meters of this. For the lining, we'll be using our Minerva Core Range Anti-Static Super Soft Lining in the color 285. This lining is indeed super soft and my absolute favorite lining to work with. It's soft and light without being too slippery, and it feels really nice on the skin, plus it sews really great too. We'll be using another 70 centimeters of this. To help with structure, we'll be using some traditional interfacing. This interfacing is going to be sewn in rather than ironed on. We'll be using the color natural here, but this shouldn't be visible at all. We'll need between 1.5 and 1.8 meters of this depending on the side you're making. The last structural piece is of course the boning. We're using the hemline featherlight boning in color black. This comes in a cotton casing so we don't have to make boning channels. 4 meters of this should be enough. For our eyelets, we're using the Hemline Metal Eyelets Kit. This contains the black eyelets, which measure 5.5 millimeters, and the tool to apply them. You'll also need a hammer to use this tool, so make sure you have one on hand later. To lace up the back, we're going to be using 1.9 meters of the Stephanie Rectail cord in the color bottle green. To make our ribbons that tie the straps, we'll use 1.4 meters of the Beresford's double-faced satin ribbon in the color Forest. And for thread, we'll use Gutermann Sewall polyester sewing thread in the color 18, or you can use our thread matching service if you choose a different color of fabric.
Alright, all of these items, as always, are going to be linked below so that you can find everything you need to sew along with me. And remember to save this video if you want to sew along at your own pace.
After cutting our paper pattern pieces, we'll fold our fabric with right sides together and place the paper on top. As always, we'll want to keep the grain lines in mind, but when working with velvet, you also want to keep the nap of the fabric in mind. The nap is the direction of the pile. When you run your hand over the velvet, it will feel smooth if the pile is going down and rough if the pile is going up or against the nap. This is important when working with velvet because the direction of the pile will make the velvet look darker or lighter. That means that the same fabric can appear a different shade when cutting in a different direction. Therefore, we are treating velvet like a directional pattern today and cutting all of our pieces accordingly. For View A, we're going to need pattern pieces 1 to 7 and 14. There's not too many pattern pieces for this, but you do need to cut them out of 3 different layers, so I find it helpful to make myself a list on a scrap piece of paper that I can take off as I work. cutting, we'll also transfer the notches and markings to the fabric on the wrong side using tailor's chalk. Out of our contrast fabric, we'll be cutting one of piece 14 on the single layer. This is what we'll be making our bias tape from later, so it is important to match the grain line correctly. The markings of piece 14 are just lines 5 centimeters or 2 inches apart from each other. Now we're going to need to match up our main fabric pieces with their interfacing counterparts, except for piece number 7. Then, working on a flat surface, we're going to baste them all together around the edges. I like to work in the seam allowance so that I don't need to remove those stitches later. The seam allowance for this pattern is 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters, apart from all around the outer edges of the corset where the bias binding will go. Then the seam allowance is 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters. We'll then stay stitch the side edges of the middle, front, and front sections above the waist. Then we'll pin the middle front sections to the front with right sides together, matching the notches and clipping if necessary. Next, we'll stitch that in place and press the seams open, clipping it all along the seam allowance as this whole garment is curved. When pressing velvet, it's advisable to use a scrap piece of velvet and place it over the part you are pressing with right sides together. This will prevent the iron from crushing the pile of the velvet. We also need to stay stitch the single notched edge of the side fronts above the waist. Then we'll pin the side fronts to the middle fronts with right sides together, matching the notches. We can stitch that in place, press the seams open, and clip the seam allowance. After that, we'll pin the middle back to the back with right sides together, matching the notches. Then we'll go ahead and stitch that, press the seams open, and clip. Next, we'll pin the side backs to the middle backs with right sides together, matching the notches. After stitching, we can press the seams open and clip. Lastly, we'll pin the front to the back pieces at the sides with right sides together, making sure to match the notches. Then we'll stitch that in place, press the seams open, and clip. Now that our outer corset is put together, we will repeat all those steps with our lining fabric. With right sides together, we have to fold the back extension along the fold line. This is piece number 7. We'll stitch that and leave an opening for turning. Then we'll trim the corners and seam allowance, turn it right side out, press and slip stitch the opening closed. On the outside of our lining bodice, we'll pin the extension to the right side of the back, matching the seamed edge to the placement line. We can then stitch that down close to the edge, making sure to backstitch at both ends to secure it. Now, we'll cut a piece of boning the length of each seam. We'll also take the time to slide back the casing and trim away 3/4 of an inch or 2 centimeters of boning on each end, making sure to round out the edges. Then we can pin the boning to the wrong side of the lining, centering it over its respective seam. We'll stitch them down along the edges, either by hand or very carefully using your sewing machine. The instructions ask that we baste the upper and lower edges of the boning, but I just stitched them when I was doing the long edges. You can do all of the boning in one go, as shown on the pattern instructions, but I found it more manageable to do it one seam at a time. When we've got all our boning in, we can pin the lining to the corset with wrong sides together, making sure we match all of those seams and keeping the extension free. Then we can use our sewing machine's longest stitch to baste along all of the raw edges. To make the bias, we'll first pin the short ends of piece 14 together, with right sides together, matching the notches. Here, the ends will not align. We'll stitch that down and press the seam open. Starting at one end, we'll cut along the lines we marked, forming one continuous strip of bias tape. To form the binding, we'll fold the bias strip in half lengthwise with wrong sides together and press. Then we'll open that out, bring the raw edges to the center crease, still with wrong sides together, and press that in place. Lastly, we can give the folded strip a press too for a good measure. Alternatively, you could also use a bias tape maker if you have one. Next, we can encase the back opening edges of the corset with our freshly made binding. I used magic clips to keep that in place and then stitched it down close to the edges. Then we'll cut off a piece of boning the size of the back opening edge, and once we've removed it from the casing, we can cut off 1.5 inches or 3.8 centimeters, rounding the edges of the boning as before. Now we'll insert the boning piece into the binding, and then we can baste the upper and lower edges or just put a clip or pin there until the next step. Repeat for both back opening edges. Next, we'll encase the neck, armhole, and shoulder edges of the corset with our binding tape, making sure to open out the ends and turning them in at the edges for a perfect finish. The instructions tell us to baste that through all the thicknesses and then stitch, but I wanted to avoid a visible stitching, so I did something a little different. I opened up the binding and stitched it right sides together along the edges. Then I turned the binding back to the wrong side of the corset and tacked it down by hand. Whatever method you choose, we'll have to slip stitch the ends of the binding close when we are done applying it. And of course, we'll have to repeat that process for the lower edges of the corset too. To apply the eyelets at their markings, we'll first be using an awl to poke a hole in the fabric. I found I needed to go in with my scissors to make the hole a little bit bigger to allow the eyelet in, so definitely test this out in a scrap piece of fabric before you go onto the corset. I like to work on a solid and firm surface like my desk and cover it with a towel or blanket to avoid scratching it. Now we'll place an eyelet on the lining side of the corset and cover it with a ring or a washer on the main side. To use the tool in our kit, we'll remove the indented metal part called Tool A from the holder and place it in our towel. Next, we'll place the eyelet on Tool A and the metal part of the holder over the eyelet. Then it's time to hammer that in place. Use a couple strong hammerings rather than lots of gentle ones, and always double check if your eyelet is clamped tightly before moving on to the next one. And then we'll repeat that for all the eyelet markings on both back opening edges as well as the shoulder edges. To lace up the back of the corset, we'll use our rat tail cording. You can start at the top or at the bottom depending on what is more comfortable to you or what you personally find more aesthetically appealing. I chose to lace from the top down because I find it easier to tie the knots at the back this way. Then we'll cut our length of ribbon in half and thread each piece through the eyelets of each shoulder to tie them in a bow at the front. I also cut the ends of the ribbon in a V shape for decorative purposes, and finally I heat sealed all of the ends of ribbon and cording.
I am so happy with this make. I think this is the cutest little cottagecore piece. I can also see it being worn as a cosplay item or even in historical dress, depending on what periods you're using and how much historical accuracy you want to use. The fabric is so beautiful and I really love this color. I actually already had a headband that matched perfectly. It feels incredibly luxurious, but is also super soft, and it has this lovely structure to it that I am in love with. This corset is actually super comfortable, which is a common misconception about corsetry. People tend to assume that they're going to be uncomfortable and tight, and you can tighten them up as much or as little as you want. It's actually helping my back pain, so this is great. I'm really glad that I got to make this. In terms of the pattern and the fit, I was actually quite surprised that the pattern fit me so well without any alteration. I always tend to have some bodice issues with Butterick patterns, so I always end up having to go in and tweak a little at the pattern until it fits me perfectly. But this one fit me straight out of the envelope. I didn't have to do any alterations, any fidgeting with it, so I'm really surprised at that. I'm quite happy that I didn't have to do it. Although this pattern uses some more advanced techniques like applying boning, I actually found the construction of the bodice really easy to put together. The corset itself was really easy to sew. So if you're looking for a fun corset pattern that will challenge your skills, then maybe this is the one for you. If you do make your own version, don't forget to share it with us because we would love to see it. In order to do that, you will have to have your own account on our website, and it's totally free to create an account. All you have to do is click the sign up button and register to create an account, and then you can post photos and videos of all of your makes, of your projects that you're still in the make. You can share to your heart's content within the community. You can also tag products that you've used so that you help other people find things more easily. Of course, it's also a really great place to meet like-minded people from all over the world who share the same interests as you and who, in my experience, are all really nice. That is it for me for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!